We'll Meet Again by George deValier. Chapter 1. Winter, late 1943, London, England. The Americans were starting to drive Arthur mad. For weeks now, his London pub had been full of loud, obnoxious, carousing American servicemen on leave. They yelled, they drank, they fought occasionally, they drank, they flirted with the local girls, and then they drank some more. Then they did it all over again. To begin with, it was a vaguely interesting break in the same tedious old routine. By the end of the second night, Arthur had had enough. To be honest, they weren't all bad. They generally tried to be well behaved. They poured a lot of money into his pub, and, after all, they were allies fighting a common enemy. Truth be told, they weren't starting to drive Arthur mad at all. He was. "Hey, Art, buddy, another bourbon here." Arthur looked up at the grinning blonde holding his empty glass over the bar. Everything about the American irritated Arthur. The absurd bomber jacket he lived in, his perpetual grin, the way he never combed his bloody hair, and the arrogance. Arthur had not been the least bit surprised to learn that he was a fighter pilot. Thought the whole bloody British Isle owed him their freedom and allegiance. Arthur gritted his teeth and snatched the glass. "My name is Arthur, and kindly refrain from calling me your buddy." Arthur reached for the bourbon. Ghastly American stuff. He barely went through a bottle a year before the war. Since the Americans turned up, he went through a carton a night. "All right, sorry, Arthur," Alfred grinned. He was obviously used to getting his way with that grin, but it bloody well wasn't going to work with Arthur. "Come have a drink with us." Arthur clenched the bottle a little too strongly as he poured it into the glass. "Thank you, but no, I'm working." Alfred just laughed at that. "I thought you owned the damn place. Let someone else pour the drinks for a while. Take a load off." Another irritating thing, that ridiculous accent. Alfred seemed to be able to stretch every word into 7 syllables. Arthur suppressed his irritation, pushed the glass across the bar, and attempted to be polite. He had a reputation as a gentleman to uphold, after all. "Thank you again, but I'm afraid I'm run off on my feet with all you soldiers." "Soldiers?" Alfred gasped loudly and put a hand to his chest in mock outrage. "Why, Arthur, you wound me! Don't you know that I'm the youngest flight leader in all the U.S. Army Air Fighter divisions?" Arthur finished for him monotonously. "This must be the 12th, I believe it is, time you have informed me of the fact." Alfred just kept grinning as he took a swig of bourbon. "Oh, don't you go forgetting it and call me a soldier. That's an insult to a man, that is." Arthur shook his head as he glared at the American. The arrogance was unfathomable. "I do apologize," he said sarcastically. "Will you ever forgive me?" Alfred leaned fervently across the bar. Don't be like that, Arthur. Of course I'll forgive you." Arthur rolled his eyes, but Alfred did not seem to notice. "Hey, I know. Make it up to me by having that drink with us, yeah?" "I already told you I'm working." Alfred's face fell just slightly. Arthur felt the tiniest stab of guilt, and could not stop himself from adding, "Maybe another time." It was the 6th time this week he'd given that answer, but Alfred still brightened at the words. "Well, all right then, I'll see you later. I look forward to having that drink with you." Alfred winked, picked up his bourbon, and sauntered back to his table. Arthur let out a deep breath. He turned and placed the bourbon back on the shelf, took a cloth from beneath the bar, and began wiping the bar top vigorously. Arthur had never dealt with something like this before. Customers had asked him for drinks. He served them. None of them had ever asked to join them. Hell, most of them barely spared a word for him. Yet this American pilot had bothered him every night for a week, coming to the bar for constant refills, chatting inanely, telling stupid jokes, and bragging wildly. Arthur could not understand it. Of course, a tiny, hopeful part of his brain still held the smallest suspicion, but no, Arthur had spent too long suppressing that secret part of himself. The reason he had no close friends, the reason his brothers hated him, the reason he cut himself off from society, the reason even his country's armed forces refused to accept him. He had learned from his past mistakes, and knew better than to see his own secret wishes and desires where actually there was nothing. But then, what was it about this bloody Yank? Why did he keep asking Arthur to drink with him? Why did he keep looking over at Arthur behind the bar and waving? Why did he have to grin like that? And why the bloody hell did it affect Arthur so much when he did? Arthur glanced over at the pilot's table. He always sat at the same one, by the second front window, and with that other fellow who looked so much like him that Arthur wondered if they were brothers. Sure enough, Alfred was looking right at him, and grinning. Arthur quickly looked down. This was preposterous. He ran a hand over his heated forehead and felt it burning red. Throwing the cloth down, Arthur stormed over to the other side of the busy pub. Surely there must be some empty glasses to pick up. An elderly regular nodded to him as he passed. "Are you dealing with all these bloody Yanks, then, Arthur?" Arthur gave a short laugh, then backed into a table to avoid a drunk soldier stumbling past. "He's keeping me on my feet, I can tell you that much." The old man threw the soldier a dirty look. "Ah, well, chin up, boy. You don't even know why we need him here. It's not as though our boys can't take on the Jerrys without him." "Rather," agreed Arthur, nodding acknowledgement to a group of loud Americans signalling for service. "Ah, well, my lad, with the way things are shaping up on the continent, it won't be long before they're out of your hair, I imagine. I can hardly wait." Why did Arthur not even know if he meant it? His eyes flashed fleetingly towards Alfred's table before he quickly turned to serve the table of rowdy soldiers. A few hours later, with the place, thankfully, somewhat quieter, Arthur had finally had a chance to wipe down the vacant tables and collect empty glasses. He did have a few staff, but they only worked occasionally, and Arthur barely even knew their names. He preferred to do most of the work here himself. This was his pub, after all, the Emerald Lion. It wasn't much, but it was his entire life. It was everything he knew. The long bar that ran across the room, the old wooden tables and chairs that had never been replaced, the huge fireplace and its ornate mantelpiece, the ancient brick walls, the creaky, narrow staircase that led down to the cold, dark cellar and up to his cozy, familiar living area. Arthur knew every part of this place like his own body. It had always been a family business, but Arthur was the last family member left here now. He felt it his duty to do as much as possible on his own. Arthur headed back to the bar, glancing around the room as he went. Most of the patrons left were locals. The more intoxicated Americans had already been dragged back to base, but a few remained to have a few quiet drinks before close, including Alfred. Arthur tried to avoid looking his way, but he could not ignore the loud voice that called to him as he walked past the American's table. "Arthur, buddy, how about you finally come have that drink you promised?" "I promised no such—" Arthur trailed off, faced with Alfred's pleading expression. He sighed. This could not be a good idea. "Very well, then, one moment." Arthur went to the bar, deposited the empty glasses in the sink, and poured himself a small glass of rum. After all, the place was fairly quiet. Maybe this would finally stop Alfred's constant requests, as well as put Arthur's own curiosities to rest.